record here. Okay, you're good. I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Yep, I'm sorry, that was the mute button. Sorry, I apologize for that. And I apologize, I'm in a location with not strong Wi-Fi, so if I have problems, Winna, just let me know and I'll try to switch to my telephone hotspot. So good morning and thank you to everyone for being with us today. We want to thank Dr. Bill Berman, who's also joining us to talk about the rising cases, COVID cases in our community and the impact that it has had on the Denver Public Schools and where we are. Yesterday, we listened as both Mayor Hancock and Governor Polis spoke to our city and state about the rising case count of COVID cases and the challenges that we're facing as a community. Based on this information, we've updated our plans for in-person learning to respond to this concerning trend. First and foremost, I want to thank and acknowledge all of Team DPS, including our students and families, for their patience and resilience with what has been a tumultuous school year, certainly so far. I also want to say how heartbroken I am that we are here. Our efforts to gradually reopen our schools to educate and care for our children is absolutely the right thing to do. And at the same time, we know that we need to balance this with the needs of our community to help drive COVID rates down. Since the start of this crisis, there's been no easy answer, but keeping everyone's health and safety at the forefront has really helped guide our decision making. So as a result of what we have learned on cases in our community, we have decided to return to 100% remote learning for most of our students. For our early childhood, first and second grade students, however, we will continue with full-time in-person learning. And the rationale for having our youngest learners is that we know that our youngest learners struggle the most with remote learning. These are our developing readers, and in-person support is absolutely critical to ensure that they're getting a solid foundation for their education. We're also seeing that in-person conditions for these students are very low. Our ECE through second grade active cases for our students right now are at 0.14% and under 1% for staff in our elementary schools. The COVID risks for students in the early elementary grades are also very low, for early elementary grades are also very low for our elementary school early grade students, according to our health partners. Our newcomer centers, our remote learning support centers, and our special ed center programs will also continue to offer full-time in-person learning for all grades throughout the end of the semester. And the rationale for keeping these specialized programs open is that we know that these students who are in our center programs, our special education, our newcomer, and our remote learning support centers are some of the highest need students who desperately need and require in-person support to be able to meaningfully engage in their learning. At times, it's the only place where our students can get access to reliable broadband internet to meaningfully interact with their classes. Our third through fifth grade students will stay in person through the end of this week, October 30th, and students will have the opportunity to gather their supplies to prepare for remote learning. We'll shift into remote learning for third through fifth grade beginning on Monday, November 2nd, through the Thanksgiving holiday, at which point we will reassess health conditions. Our greatest hope is that everyone in our community takes very seriously the health orders to help drive these COVID cases down. And the rationale for this shift, we know that all elementary school students benefit from in-person instruction and support. And at the same time, we are concerned that our overall community trend requires us to shift more of our staff and students into remote learning, as hard as it is. Our grades 6 through 12 students will remain in remote learning through the end of the semester. Making this decision, we knew already that we were in remote learning for 6th through 12th grade, and moving into remote learning for the remainder of the semester will allow our middle school and high school teachers and students to focus on quality remote learning. The health conditions for older students are unlikely to improve enough before the end of the semester to allow for safe in-person schooling without the risk of frequent disruptions from quarantining for our middle school and high school students. We will, as I mentioned, have remote learning support provided at a number of sites through our Discovery Link program, which offers licensed childcare, as well as through expanded remote learning support centers, which in many ways serve the same function as community pods, however they're in our schools. Those will be available and staffed with school-based staff and central office staff who are working in our buildings. We'll be sharing more details on hours and locations in the coming days. And the rationale for doing this is we want to make sure that we're providing as much support as we can to our families during this difficult time. We are very committed to delivering strong remote instruction based on the changes that we've made, based on feedback from students, families, and staff. We've used frequent surveys throughout the pandemic to help learn more about people's needs and desires. We continue to make sure that each class is set up as much as possible for remote learning so that families and students can access the support they need, including for our students in person who at times will need to transition back and forth based on quarantining needs. I will now turn it over to Dr. Bill Berman from Denver Health, who will share more about the health conditions that our community is facing right now.
Susanna, I think I would summarize this in a set of three things. There's certainly concerning news, and Susanna talked about some of that. There's some good news here, and then I'll end with a sense of our shared responsibility. So the concerning news you've heard, I'm sure, in the last couple of days around Denver, around the metro area, around the entire state, and indeed around the entire region. Case rates have increased. Denver specifically is now in what's called safer at home level 3, the so-called orange zone of the COVID-19 dial of the state of Colorado. And that's just an indication that community transmission is quite active and at a level that requires the re-imposition of a number of social distancing measures. So those are happening with level 3 safer at home. So decreases in any gathering size, decrease or additional restrictions on businesses, all to try to help us restore control of COVID transmission in our community. Within that certainly concerning news, there's some good news as well. And Susanna mentioned some specific figures, but I think they add to a growing picture that we're getting from DPS, from other schools in the other school districts in the metro area, and indeed from around the country, that schools can be safe places even during times of quite substantial community transmission when we follow the basic layered prevention measures, the DPS 5. And so again, it's just additional affirmation that these layered measures of symptom screening, rapid evaluation of symptomatic staff and kids, masking, distancing, hand washing, moving out activities outside whenever possible, they work when we put them together, when we layer them together, and they can work even in times of quite substantial community transmission. And let me just close my initial remarks with a sense of our shared responsibility. As Susanna said, the schools are not what's driving transmission in our community. Rather, the schools are affected by the current level of community transmission. And the implications of that are clear. The responsibility for being able to safely reopen schools for all grades in our community is on each of us. On each of us to do those perhaps somewhat tiresome but necessary basic prevention measures in all of our lives. So I'll stop there and happily entertain questions.
Okay, our first question is from Jesus at Univision. Go ahead, Jesus. Jesus, if you're there, feel free to unmute to ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Susana, in Spanish, por favor, ¿puedes decirnos cuáles serían las nuevas regulaciones para los estudiantes de DPS?
Okay. So, un momento, déjeme hablar en español sobre lo que estamos haciendo. Desafortunadamente, recibimos las noticias de que los casos de COVID están subiendo en nuestra comunidad y usando esta información tenemos que cambiar nuestros planes para servir a nuestros alumnos adentro de nuestras escuelas. Para los alumnos en pre-kinder, primer grado y segundo grado, vamos a seguir ofreciendo clases presenciales 5 días a la semana. Y la razón por qué vamos a seguir con estos grados es, sabemos que los alumnos más chiquitos realmente batallan más con el aprendizaje virtual. Es muy difícil para los más chiquitos aprender a leer usando computadora. A veces ni saben cómo escribir muy bien y realmente es muy, muy, muy difícil y queremos asegurar que les estamos ofreciendo una educación tan fuerte posible en este tiempo tan difícil. También sabemos que para esta edad los alumnos, con permiso, los alumnos están al menos riesgo de COVID y ni tampoco de contratar ni transmitir COVID y queremos asegurar que estamos ofreciendo clases a estos alumnos. También vamos a seguir con los programas en nuestros centros para los alumnos que reciben la educación especial y también para los alumnos que están aprendiendo inglés como segundo idioma y están en el empiezo del aprendizaje del inglés. Sabemos que estos alumnos realmente tienen necesidades muy altas y queremos asegurar que estamos ayudándoles con su aprendizaje. Para los alumnos de tercer grado hasta quinto, vamos a seguir esta semana con clases presenciales, pero empezando lunes vamos a cambiar a clases virtuales para todos nuestros alumnos, por lo menos hasta el Día de Gracias. Esta semana vamos a tomar en cuenta lo que está pasando con COVID en nuestra comunidad y tomar decisiones para diciembre. Y para los alumnos del sexto grado hasta el 12 de la secundaria y preparatoria, vamos a mantener el plan de aprendizaje virtual por este semestre hasta los finales de diciembre. También vamos a seguir con los centros de apoyo en el aprendizaje virtual en muchas de nuestras escuelas para ayudarles a los alumnos que están batallando mucho con el aprendizaje virtual.
Thanks. Jenny from CPR. Go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm wondering, in your consultations with health officials, you're focused a lot on the risks due to COVID, and I'm wondering if you can tell us more about how and with whom you make the risk calculations when weighing not being in school, so isolation, depression, social development, that the Colorado chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics talks about, with the low risk of COVID transmission in schools.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And definitely want to name, it's super challenging, and I have come to understand this year probably in a more humbling way than I ever have in my life, the challenges of facing multiple bad choices. And want to be really clear, I believe deeply that our students are served best when we can serve them in person. And our goal is always going to be to try to do that. But we want to be able to do that in a way that minimizes the disruptions of frequent quarantines, that allows, we've heard repeatedly from parents, both around the desire to be in school, but the desire to have a plan that doesn't change. And our concern currently, particularly with our older students and with the number of teachers that we have, is the impact of quarantining classrooms of kids. Want to be really clear and transparent. We're not seeing big transmission within our schools, but we are seeing the impact of frequent disruptions. And I think we, in many ways, had the perfect storm of bringing more and more students back into our school at the exact same time that we saw cases rising in the community. Those cases definitely reflected in the cases that we saw in our schools. And it's not the same across the city. And so I know that there are some people sitting in schools feeling very cheated of the opportunity for in-person learning because their school may not have had much impact from COVID cases or quarantines, while other schools have had multiple classrooms that have been impacted, not because of spread inside school, just because of the high number of COVID cases within the community. And so as we look at that, we spend hours with our colleagues at Denver Health, including Dr. Federico, who is here on the call, I believe, or at least he was earlier. I think I see his name, who is a pediatrician and is constantly urging us to weigh the risks on both sides, because it's not that there is no risk for being fully remote. As you mentioned, there are all of the risks of isolation, of depression, of normal socialization and child development. None of these are very easy as we come to face them. It is incredibly challenging, and we really do try to weigh both the health and safety risks from disruption, from distraction, from doing the basics, as well as the health and safety risks around the social emotional development. Dr. Federico, if you want to speak up about how you view it as a pediatrician, maybe that would be helpful here.
Yeah, hi everybody. Jenny, I think you're asking the right question. How difficult is it for us to weigh the options of having all of the advantages of in-person learning for our students and all of the great things, not only academically, but socio-emotionally that come from in-person learning. And what I can say is that DPS has worked very hard towards having that be the goal. But you have to weigh it against the real epidemiologic data of rampant spread that we have. And unfortunately, I think right now, our students are losing out on the opportunity to have in-person learning because of our failure as a community to keep COVID rates down. And I think we need to work harder as a community to come together, to work together, to do the things that we know work, to drive the rates down so that we have fewer cases of COVID coming from our community into our schools, promoting disruption. There's no question our students will be better off when we can get them back in person for a number of reasons. And we weigh this every week. We look at the rates, we look at the number of disruptions that are happening, and think about all the great advantages that come from school. And so they're difficult questions, and the conversation changes over time. And I hope that that these new changes that are coming out as a result of being in level 3 will drive the rates down over several weeks, and we can return to in-person learning if we get to a better space.
Jenny, can I just add just a couple words to Dr. Federico, and that is we communicate very closely with the surrounding areas. So the public health departments of the metro area, we look at their data, we look at their experience. I know Superintendent Cordova also consults very closely with her colleagues around the metro area to share ideas, to share data, to share what we've learned. So all of that goes into the mix.
Thanks. Teeny with the Denver Post, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you guys. We've talked a lot about how conditions may not be safe for older students for the rest of the semester. I'm wondering, have you guys discussed any sort of threshold or anything that would trigger a return to remote learning for the youngest students that are currently going in person?
Yeah, thanks, Teeny. We definitely have been discussing that so that we could look at a combination of both what we see in the community and what we see inside our schools. We do have several weeks of data, certainly for our youngest learners, and that's work that we had intended to do this week prior to learning about the safer at home level 3. So we are going to continue to have conversations about that. We've been looking at the model that Cherry Creek has used, which looks both at what's the impact of COVID in the community surrounding our schools, as well as what's happening within our schools with cases of COVID with students, as well as cases of COVID with staff. So that we have the ability to get a read on how is the outside school landscape impacting the inside school landscape.
Tori with CBS, go ahead, Tori.
Hi, Susanna. Could you please elaborate on the decision to keep younger elementary students in school in regards to their learning ability? You know, is there a big difference between a third grader's ability to learn online and a second grader's? And then a follow-up to that, since the announcement, have you heard from any 3 to 5 teachers who have just had that little taste of seeing their students learn in person for a short time and worry this might be a disservice?
Yeah, so thank you. I do just want to name, like, as we face these challenges, it is super hard to think about where it makes sense, how it makes sense, and how to prioritize when we know that my personal strongest desire would be to have all of our students back in person at some level. As we looked at what we have heard both from our family members, from our teachers, and from our students in many cases, a little bit less from our students of the youngest grades, is just how incredibly challenging it is for our youngest learners to learn in a meaningful way in a remote setting if they haven't really established the foundational blocks for reading. So much of what does happen in a virtual space is students interacting both via the computer, via writing, and via reading frequently independently. And so that's really tough for kids when they haven't really created those strong foundational blocks for reading. Certainly, there's a lot of our third graders who look and sound very similar to our second graders. And as we considered where we were, we felt that it was going to be really important to be able to minimize the impact of people in person, giving the increased numbers of quarantining that we saw happening in our schools as we began to come back in. It's, you know, an imperfect approach for sure, but we're going to do our best. We know that for the bulk of our upper elementary students, they can much more meaningfully interact using technology. We know it's really challenging, and we're going to try to make as much space available for remote learning support centers for students who will need extra support, or for families who need more help with childcare.
Thanks. Another question from Teeny at the Post. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that you guys are looking at sort of the structure that Cherry Creek has used, and I've heard a lot of grief about this structure from parents and teachers in the district, you know, weighing student and staff incident rates when you're not testing everyone who needs to go into quarantine has raised a few eyebrows. So I'd love for some of the doctors on the line to talk a little bit more about this metric and why you think it's important to use, and if you think it tells the whole story.
Yeah, Tina, this is Bill Berman from Denver Public Health. Certainly there are limitations with the metrics that Cherry Creek has adopted and that we're putting in place as well. However, what we know from the work done in other schools and other places is that the risk of transmission within the school is really quite low, so often between 0 and 1%. And so I don't think, and we have limitations in testing capacity. So given that background rate of expected transmission, particularly when the basics are being followed, we don't think it's either necessary or the right priority to try to routinely test all of the hundreds and hundreds of students who, as they're going into and out of quarantine, because the expected rate of COVID is very low. And gets to be low enough that even the performance characteristics of the tests become somewhat problematic. So we think we're comfortable that these metrics, while imperfect, give us a very reasonable view of the risk of transmission within the schools, and that we can continue to use them.
Okay, Jenny, CPR, go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm just reading something wrong, but one of the rationales you used for opening up the very youngest learners was the COVID rate for students and teachers, 0.14% for students, under 1% for elementary staff. But then on the dashboard, if I'm reading that right, it says for all DPS students, it was 0.09%, and for the staff, 0.38%, which is lower. So I'm just trying to understand the rationale.
Thanks, Jenny. So the dashboard actually includes all DPS staff and all DPS students if they're in person or if they're in remote. So it's obviously a much larger group of people. We really wanted to look at where we were. And to be clear, for all groups, it is very low. We definitely know that. And we wanted to make sure that we were looking at data specifically about our youngest students who have been in person with staff who have been in person to help inform the decision around where we are.
Okay, great. So that includes remote then for the...
On the dashboard, yeah. And I think it's labeled that way. You can see on the dashboard, it's labeled.
Okay, thank you.
In person and remote. So it's all staff members, all students.
Kim at Fox, go ahead, Kim.
Hi, I actually had two quick questions. One is for Dr. Federico. I was just wondering if you have any quick advice for families. I know I've heard from parents who say their kids are moody and just a little off with all of the changes. Do you have just a quick suggestion for families on how to handle all of this change? And then also I was hoping to just confirm, how many weeks was it that the students who did go back in person were actually in in-person school?
Great, I'll answer that second question first, and then we'll see if Dr. Federico is still here and he can answer the first one. So we started bringing our students back in person right after Labor Day in our ECE centers. Our ECE kinder and first grade students have been in person the longest. We had just begun bringing back our second through fifth grade students last week.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, first of all, children in general are quite resilient, and we need to give them credit for that resiliency, and we need to affirm that resiliency as caregivers. I think children very much appreciate predictable routine. And so developmentally, for the ages that we're talking about specifically, the older elementary school age, to recreate that routine as much as we can in the home setting while children are learning online, I think is essential. So having a routine where your child wakes up, eats breakfast, gets dressed as if they're gonna go to school, has a designated workspace that is their defined space, and when they do have breaks, either between school or after school, that you recreate that outside playtime, that socialization that can still happen safely with spacing and outside. Similarly, the advice, in addition to supporting your child on the emotional side, is also to support as a community the things that we need to do to drive down COVID rates so that we can get back to in-person learning. The onus of that is on us. It is not on other people. It is on us as in a community, and we need to hear that as we move to more restrictions and abide by those, because the more that we can come together and abide by those recommendations that we know scientifically work, the sooner we get back to in-person learning. And so I very much think that that's an important part of the message that we're trying to send today.
Okay, thanks everyone. I think that's it for questions, and we'll be back next week. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone.